early hours of the 27th of October, 1857, around 100 Yiman warriors attack a homestead called Hornet Bank on the upper Dawson River in what's now central Queensland. By morning, 11 settlers are dead, 8 of them members of a single family, the Frasers. It's remembered today as one of the deadliest attacks on white settlers in Australian colonial history, and it has its own memorial, a stone cairn, listed on Queensland's official heritage register. Most accounts of this story start and end right there, a horrifying attack on an isolated family, presented without much context for why it happened, or what came directly after it. What happened over the following months doesn't have a memorial at all. In the reprisal killings that followed Hornet Bank, conducted by native police, armed settler posses, and one particular man with a very personal grudge, at least 150 Aboriginal people were killed. Some historians, working from the same surviving records, think the true number was closer to 300, maybe more. It effectively shattered the entire Yiman population and their way of life within a matter of months. The man most responsible for that, who by his own community's reckoning personally killed more Aboriginal people than anyone else in Australian colonial history, was never once arrested for it. He died in his 80s, a respected member of his town. Welcome to Truth Be Told, Stories from Black Australia. This podcast is recorded on Whadjuk Noongar country, and we acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people as the traditional custodians of the land this show is made on. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present. We extend that respect to all the traditional custodians across the lands from where you are listening from, and to all First Nations peoples listening. Today we're talking about the Hornet Bank Massacre, what actually led up to it, and the months-long campaign of killing that followed, a campaign Queensland's own colonial authorities knew about in detail and chose never to prosecute. Quick note before we keep going. This episode discusses an attack that included sexual violence against several of the victims, followed by an extended period of reprisal killings against Aboriginal people, including women and children. Take care of yourself while you listen. If anything in this brings something up for you, 13 Yarn is a crisis line run entirely by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, any hour of the day or night, on 13 92 76. Alright, let's go back to how this particular stretch of the Dawson River ended up this volatile in the first place. The upper Dawson River was Yiman country, also recorded historically as Yiman, Yeoman, or Yiman, and known by the people themselves today as Yiman. A Scottish immigrant named Andrew Scott took up a pastoral lease over Yiman land at a place called Goongarry in the early 1850s, and in March of 1854 leased the property on to a shipwright named John Fraser. Fraser died of pneumonia later that same year, and his widow, Martha, continued running the property with their 9 children. Unlike Scott, who'd specifically warned against it, the Fraser family chose to befriend the local Yiman, drawing on experience some of them had with Aboriginal stockmen and workers on other properties further south. That relative goodwill existed inside a much wider, much uglier pattern of violence that had already been unfolding across the district for years before Hornet Bank ever became a household name. Settlers, expanding into the upper Dawson, had already been responsible for poisonings, shootings, and sexual violence against Yiman people, women in particular, in the years leading up to 1857. Poisoned flour left out as bait was a documented tactic used against Aboriginal people on multiple Queensland frontiers during this exact period, a method that could kill dozens at a time without a single settler ever having to fire a shot or stand trial for it. This is the part of the story settler memorials and a lot of popular retellings leave out almost entirely, that the attack on the Fraser household didn't come out of nowhere. It came after years of exactly the kind of violence the Yiman were about to be accused, almost 200 times over, of committing themselves. In the early hours of the 27th of October, 1857, the attack came. Around 100 Yiman men, joined by a small number of men from outside their own community, moved on the Hornet Bank homestead. Inside were Martha Fraser, 8 of her 9 children, the family's tutor, and 2 station hands who lived nearby. By most accounts, the original intention was narrower than what actually unfolded, but after one of the Fraser sons confronted the group and was killed, the attack escalated. The men, women, and the family's tutor inside the house were killed. Several of the women were also sexually assaulted before they died. Only one member of the household survived, 14-year-old Sylvester Fraser, who was struck on the head and left for dead, falling unconscious between his bed and the wall. When he came to after the attackers had gone, he made his way to a neighbouring station to raise the alarm and then rode more than 500 kilometres to Ipswich with his older brother William, who'd been away at the time, to bring him home. What happened after William Fraser got back is the actual centre of this story, and it's the part that almost never gets the word massacre attached to it in the way Hornet Bank itself does. It's worth understanding, briefly, what the native police actually was, since they're the institution that carried out most of the killing that followed. Established in the 1840s and expanded through the following decades, the force recruited Aboriginal men, often from regions far from wherever they were deployed, specifically so they had no kinship ties to the communities they were sent to police, and placed them under the command of white officers with almost total discretion to use lethal force against Aboriginal people in the name of dispersal, a deliberately vague colonial term that covered everything from moving people off land to outright killing. Queensland came to rely on this force more heavily and for longer than almost any other Australian colony, and the response to Hornet Bank shows exactly why colonial authorities found it such a useful tool. A body of armed men who could be sent to kill Aboriginal people en masse with minimal paperwork and essentially no risk of prosecution. The first official response came from Lieutenant Walter Powell of the Native Police, who tracked a group of Yiman west of the station and shot 5 of them dead. Powell then enrolled both surviving Fraser brothers, William and the badly traumatized 14-year-old Sylvester, as special constables, and took them along on a second mission that killed a further 9 people. 2 more native police officers, Moorhead and Carr, arrived shortly after with their own troopers and killed around 13 more. By December, Powell had expanded his division to 17 troopers, enough to start conducting raids on Aboriginal people who had nothing at all to do with the original attack, so-called station blacks, living peacefully at Taroom, killing 5, including 3 women who were shot as they tried to run. Powell, William Fraser, and another officer then led a further raid at a place called Huanda, killing 11 more. By April of 1858, multiple additional native police divisions, alongside private settler militias, including a vigilante group calling themselves the Browns, were active across the district, conducting what one local pastoralist later described, almost casually, in his own memoirs, as raids of indiscriminate summary justice. That same pastoralist recorded one incident in which a dozen Yiman men, identified by settlers as community leaders, were rounded up, ordered to run across an open field, and shot dead as they fled, an execution dressed up as pursuit. By March of 1858, less than 5 months after the original attack, up to 300 Yiman people had been killed. The panic triggered by Hornet Bank didn't stay confined to the upper Dawson either. Some 400 kilometres east, in the Wide Bay district, separate private punitive expeditions used the news from Hornet Bank as cover for their own indiscriminate shootings of Aboriginal men, women, and children, reportedly killing more than 300 people who'd had no connection whatsoever to the Fraser family or the Yiman Nation. Fear of one attack on one station became justification for settler violence across an enormous stretch of central and southern Queensland that had nothing to do with the original event at all. The colonial government did eventually take formal notice, though not in the way you might expect. In 1858, the Queensland Legislative Council convened a select committee on murders by Aborigines on the Dawson River. Its conclusion wasn't that the reprisals had gone too far. It was that the existing native police force needed to be expanded and better resourced to prevent further attacks like Hornet Bank in future. A parliamentary inquiry into the deaths of hundreds of Aboriginal people had looked directly at the evidence and recommended giving the people responsible more men and more funding. William Fraser himself became the single most prolific killer in this entire campaign, and arguably in the entire documented history of colonial Australia. He didn't stop once the organised native police raids wound down. He shot an Aboriginal jockey dead at the Taroom racetrack. After 2 Aboriginal men accused of involvement in the Hornet Bank attack were tried and found not guilty, he shot them both dead as they walked out of the Rockhampton courthouse in broad daylight, with no consequences. He later shot an Aboriginal woman in the main street of Toowoomba simply because he believed she was wearing a dress that had belonged to his mother. Witnesses reported that 2 policemen spoke briefly with him afterward, then saluted and walked away. Far from facing any formal consequence for any of this, Fraser was later given an official commission in the Rockhampton Native Police Force, a government appointment that let him continue pursuing the Yiman with the full authority of the colonial state behind him. Historians who've gone back through the surviving records believe he personally killed well over 100 Aboriginal people over the course of his life. He was never arrested for a single one of those deaths. When he died in 1914, at the age of 83, his obituary noted, without any apparent discomfort, that the mere mention of his name had been enough to strike fear into Aboriginal people in the district for decades afterward. It's worth sitting, for a second, with exactly how lopsided the public memory of all this became, almost immediately, and has stayed ever since. In 1957, on the 100th anniversary of the Hornet Bank attack, descendants of Andrew Scott erected a concrete memorial at the Fraser family's gravesite. In 2008, that gravesite and memorial were formally added to the Queensland Heritage Register, official state recognition of 11 settler deaths. There has never been an equivalent memorial anywhere for the 150 to 300 Yiman people killed in the months that followed, a death toll many times larger, inflicted largely on women, children, and people who'd had no connection whatsoever to the original attack. Researchers looking into this years later noted something telling, that an online encyclopedia could carry a detailed page for the Hornet Bank massacre while having no equivalent entry at all for what would have to be called, by any consistent standard, the Yiman massacre. For most of the 20th century, the devastation was considered close to total. Settler accounts from later generations described riding through the scrubland and finding bleached bones scattered across the grass, full-ribbed bodies, fleshless arms and grinning skulls, the physical remains of a population most colonial Queenslanders assumed had simply ceased to exist. They hadn't. Yiman people survived, scattered into surrounding towns and stations, forcibly relocated in some cases to missions and reserves, and carried their identity forward across generations, even as the outside world insisted, in print, that they were gone. In 1998, descendants of the Yiman filed a formal native title claim seeking legal recognition of their connection to their traditional homeland. That claim took 18 years to resolve, working its way through committee hearings, government negotiations, and competing interests from mining companies, regional councils, and pastoral leaseholders, who all had their own stake in the same land. On the 23rd of June, 2016, Justice John Reeves of the Federal Court sat in the town of Taroom itself, in a hall packed with Yiman families, state government representatives, and mining and pastoral interests, and formally recognized the Yiman people's native title rights over close to 14,000 square kilometres of central Queensland, an area that includes Robinson Gorge, Expedition, and Isla Gorge National Parks. The determination recognised both exclusive native title over some areas and ongoing rights to access, hunt, fish, gather, and conduct ceremony across the rest. One descendant who attended the hearing, a law student whose mother had worked on drafting the original Native Title Act itself, later wrote about what it meant to watch a federal court judge speak openly in a packed country town hall about massacres her own family had survived. She described the feeling of standing on country at sunrise before the hearing began as something close to spiritual clarity, and noted that despite everything in this episode, the Yiman had kept their language alive too, even as it's now formally classified as endangered, with community-led revival efforts underway through the Central Queensland Language Centre. Reeves didn't deliver that recognition as a dry legal formality. He spoke at length about the district's history, about the massacres, and about the forced march of more than 200 kilometres that later took Yiman survivors from the Taroom Aboriginal Reserve to another government settlement at Woorabinda, a removal that scattered the community even further from the country this whole case was about. He noted, in terms that echoed almost exactly what we've already heard from other courts on this show, that justice delayed is justice denied. So that's where we'll leave it for this one. A homestead attacked in the dark after years of unpunished violence against the people whose land it sat on. 11 settlers killed, and a memorial built for them within a century. As many as 300 Aboriginal people killed in the months that followed, with no memorial built for any of them at all, in close to 170 years. A parliamentary inquiry that looked at hundreds of deaths and recommended funding more of whatever had caused them. A man who likely killed more Aboriginal people, personally, than anyone else in this country's colonial history, never arrested, eventually deputized by the very colonial government whose laws he'd spent years operating entirely outside of, and a people the colony was certain it had wiped out completely, who survived anyway, scattered across central Queensland for 160 years, until a federal court judge stood in their own town hall and told them, formally, that the land had always been theirs. There's a reason this show keeps returning to the gap between how settler deaths and Aboriginal deaths get remembered on this continent. The cairns and heritage listings on one side, the unmarked ground and disputed numbers on the other. Hornet Bank is maybe the starkest version of that gap we've covered yet. 11 names everyone can find in an instant, and somewhere between 150 and 300 names that, in most cases, nobody bothered to even try writing down at all. If something in this one is sitting with you, let it sit for a minute before you reach for the next distraction. That discomfort is doing something useful. Thanks for listening to Truth Be Told. This has been a Three Brothers production. I'll see you next time.